Ladies and gentlemen, the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, overturned the Colorado State Supreme Court's decision on banning Trump from essentially the 2024 presidential contest. They overturned the Colorado State Supreme Court decision, number one, and you will hear exactly why. It is a 100% certainty they've essentially already overturned the conviction. Once it gets to them, and it did not get to them the other day, okay? Once it gets to them, they will overturn the conviction. You'll hear that in a second. You're going to hear President Trump in a couple of seconds before that. But number two, he got a monumental presidential immunity victory. Then there was a victory pertaining to January defendants. He's 3 for 3. He'll be 4 for 4 when it comes to, I think, also a unanimous decision overturning the Colorado ban. Hit subscribe to this channel right now. Listen to this, and then you'll listen to Trump.
Decided to prosecute his own interpretation of federal law. That's not permissible under our separation of powers and federalism, and the Supreme Court will reverse if, as you say, Mark, they get a chance to hear this case.
He's been sentenced. The appeals will then continue to go right up to the Supreme Court. They will get a chance to hear the case. This is President Trump, knowing very well it will be overturned in the Supreme Court, and he speaks to the court and the judge yesterday. This is pretty amazing audio. Hit subscribe right now to this channel. It's essentially a done deal. The conviction is overturned because the appeal process has begun. He needed to be sentenced, and I've explained this before. He needed to be sentenced for the appeal process to get to the Supreme Court. In a way, it was a victory for Trump yesterday in a roundabout way. So check this out. This is really unbelievable, and it's amazing. It's President Trump really standing up to injustice. It was a great injustice done to him.
Would your client like to be heard?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. This has been a very terrible experience. I think it's been a tremendous setback for New York and the New York court system. This is a case that Alvin Bragg did not want to bring. He thought it was, from what I read and from what I hear, inappropriately handled before he got there. A gentleman from a law firm came in and acted as a district attorney, and that gentleman, from what I heard, was a criminal or almost criminal in what he did. It was very inappropriate. It was somebody involved with my political opponent. Part of the records that we're talking about, they're saying, I just noticed where he said I was falsifying business records. Well, the falsification of business records, as they said, was calling a legal expense in the books where everybody could see them, a legal expense. In other words, that legal fees or legal expense were put down as legal expense by accountants. They weren't put down by me, they were put down by accountants. I didn't call them construction, concrete work. I didn't call them electrical work. I didn't call them anything. They called a legal fee or a legal expense, and for this, I got indicted. It's incredible, actually. Now, if you look, my attorney alluded to it, the top legal scholars and legal pundits in this country, the ones that are quoted all the time on television, that are making their views felt, and highly respected people, have said, everyone, virtually everyone that I know of, I haven't seen any to the contrary, not one, and none. These people are not exactly friends of mine, to put it mildly, but they all said this is a case that should have never been brought. It's an injustice of justice. Very respected Jonathan Turley, Andy McCarthy, Judge David Rifkin, a wonderful man who just passed away, by the way, Greg Jarrett, Ellie Honig from CNN, of all places. CNN said that. Paul Ingracian, Alan Dershowitz, they all said this is not a case that should be brought. It's not, think about it, legal expenses are down as legal expenses, and I get indicted for business records. Everybody should be so accurate. It's been a political witch hunt. It was done to damage my reputation so that I'd lose the election, and obviously that didn't work. And the people of our country got to see this firsthand because they watched the case in your courtroom. They got to see this firsthand, and then they voted, and I won and got the largest number of votes by far of any Republican candidate in history, and won, as you know, all 7 swing states, won conclusively all 7 swing states, and won the popular vote by millions and millions of votes. And they've been watching your trial, so they understood it. I wasn't allowed to use the lawyer-client privilege or the reliance on counsel. I had a lawyer that made this deal, and he admitted that. And he was also a totally discredited person. We weren't allowed to use the information from the Southern District that totally discredited him. It wasn't allowed to be put in. And that was terrible, unbelievable. And this is a man who's got no standing. He's been disbarred on other matters, unrelated. And he was allowed to talk as though he were George Washington. But he's not George Washington. He shouldn't have been allowed. The Southern District did a book of approximately 28 pages where I've never seen anything like it. They excoriated him. You wouldn't let it be put into evidence. So he was able to testify as a witness, and I think it's a disgrace to the system. I was under a gag order. I'm the first president in history that was under a gag order where I couldn't talk about aspects of the case that are very important. I guess I'm still under, so probably I won't do it now. I assume I'm still under a gag order. But the fact is that I'm totally innocent. I did nothing wrong. They talked about business records, and the business records were extremely accurately counted. I had nothing to do with them. That was done by an accountant or a bookkeeper who I think gave very credible testimony and was corroborated by everybody that was asked. And with all that's happening in our country today, with a city that's burning to the ground, one of our largest, most important cities burning to the ground, with wars that are uncontrollably going on, with all of the problems of inflation and attacks on countries and all of the horrible things that are going on, I got indicted over calling a legal expense a legal expense. It was called a legal expense. I just want to say I think it's an embarrassment to New York, and New York has a lot of problems, but this is a great embarrassment. I believe that this and other cases that were brought, as you know, the DOJ is very much involved in this case. That's because that's the political opponent they're talking about. The DOJ is very involved. You have a gentleman sitting right there from the DOJ who was from the DOJ's office. He was also involved with the New York State Attorney General's case. And he went from there to here. He went around and did what he had to do. He got them to move on me. But in the meantime, I won the election in a massive landslide. And the people of this country understand what's gone on. This has been a weaponization of government. They call it lawfare. Never happened to any extent like this, but never happened in our country before. And I'd just like to explain that I was treated very, very unfairly. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Trump.
So, number one, the sentencing leads to the Supreme Court. He had to have been sentenced. No jail, no prison. Nobody on the planet believes he's an actual convicted felon. That's an absurd leap of logic. It'll be overturned. When you think of the semantics of that phrase, it's somebody who robs a bank or takes someone's life or does something despicable like the second largest Democratic Party donor years back who was engaged in a crypto Ponzi scheme. That's what a convicted felon is, not Trump, who, by the way, it wasn't an FEC crime. The FEC dropped the case. The DOJ dropped the case. The federal government did not level an indictment against Trump. We still don't know what Trump did from a federal statute perspective. That is unconstitutional, and he has an immunity victory that I told you about. I told you he'd get a unanimous Supreme Court victory before it happened over Colorado, the state Supreme Court there. I told you he would get a monumental immunity victory. He got the January defendants' victory regarding sentencing. He's going to get this enormous, monumental, constitutional, historic, biblical victory pertaining to this guilty verdict being overturned. And he will go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will look at it, and it could be unanimous. I think it'll be unanimous, because you cannot have a state leveling a federal statute without the federal government involved. It's pretty much a done deal, like John Yoo stated. But this is Jonathan Turley.
In this or not?
No, Justice Barrett has been playing more and more of a central role, or centrist role, on the court. She's often voting with the left of the court. She's sort of carving out her own voice, her own place. And I don't want to condemn her for it. I can disagree with her decisions. She's a very thoughtful jurist. And what she did here is consistent with what a lot of appellate judges do. They really prefer overwhelmingly to have these key cases completed, to have the sentence in so they can review the whole case. They hate interlocutory appeals. They hate these things coming up in partial form. And so she's consistent in that regard.
Yeah, well, anytime you say interlocutory appeal on the Ingram angle, it's time to take a pause. Panel, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. I just got...
So they have to go through a couple more hurdles in terms of appeals, and it gets to the Supreme Court, and then they do what they did with immunity, and they do what they did with the Colorado issue. Just listen to this again, and you'll hear a little bit more from law professor John Yoo. He was also top DOJ official as well.
Is up with me, so be it. They're going to time it the same way. So this can really become a cancer on the political campaign system of the highest federal official in the United States, and the election there too, no?
Mark, I appreciate what you said in your opening statement, because the Supreme Court has made clear, not just in one offside comment, in 3 very clear decisions, that only the federal government can enforce federal law. Only the Justice Department and the Federal Election Commission can prosecute and bring suit for violations of federal election law. They're the guardians of how federal election should run. And so what happened here is that the DA, approved by this judge, Judge Merchan, grabbed the authority away and basically decided to prosecute his own interpretation of federal law. That's not permissible under our separation of powers and federalism, and the Supreme Court will reverse if, as you say, Mark, they get a chance to hear this case.
When we come back, John Yoo, that is...
They will get a chance to hear the case. The rebuttal from people as well, this is a state decision. And a state decision... hold on one second. A state decision was overturned by the Supreme Court. He won the popular vote. He won the Senate, the House, in every battleground state, and the presidency. And it is because Democrats and media focused on Pyrrhic victories. Okay? A Pyrrhic victory is a short-term win, but a long-term loss. These are Pyrrhic victories that Democrats dance and and rejoice over. Calling Trump a convicted felon is essentially like calling, let's say, Biden a very eloquent and stately and noble leader. Okay? You can say that if you'd like. Most of humanity would disagree. And so Trump is not really a convicted felon, okay? Technically, you could say, oh, yeah, yes, he is. It's like, nah, not really. If you look, there's actually no criminal charge. There's no underlying federal charge, which is one reason why it'll be overturned by the Supreme Court.
Hans, what was the underlying federal campaign violation? Did we ever find that out?
Well, there was nothing in the original indictment about any kind of federal campaign violation. They kept saying that the legal expenses, which is what were listed in the business records, should have been a campaign-related expense, the payment that was made to Stormy Daniels. But as Brad Smith, I know, would have testified, under the test applied by the FEC, this was not a campaign-related expense, period. There's just no question about that. So for this jury to say that, oh yeah, he violated federal campaign finance laws and that justifies the underlying verdict, that is such an egregious mistake that the Court of Appeals in New York, when they get this case, they ought to reverse this almost immediately because of this and so many other mistakes made in the case.
How many do you count? How many mistakes?
I lost count of how many errors were made by this judge and by the prosecution. I mean, the judge let in all kinds of irrelevant evidence that had no bearing on the charges against the president, but were obviously there to blacken the character of Donald Trump. The judge shouldn't have even been on the case. He should have recused himself because of his personal family dealings, his daughter's involvement, his making political contributions in violation of the ethics rules in New York. There are just so many mistakes and errors he made that I don't see how a Court of Appeals could not overturn this verdict.
So there was no federal crime, okay? There was no federal crime. These were misdemeanors that were expired. Hit subscribe to this channel right now. Number one, there was actually no federal crime. The federal government was not involved with this case, as the Biden administration and media have stated over and over again. That's a source of pride under the guise of being impartial and unbiased and nonpartisan. But the problem is that the federal government needed to be involved because a federal statute should have been leveled against Trump. It was not. The state government leveled a federal statute, by the way, without the right to do so. It's unconstitutional. It's never been done. There has never been an example in U.S. history, from what I understand. If I'm wrong, let me know in the live chat or in the comment section. There's never been an example of a state leveling a federal statute without the Department of Justice involved, leveling the federal statute at the individual. Hit subscribe to this channel, ladies and gentlemen. This is Hans A. von Spakovsky. You just heard him, former Federal Election Commission chairman. By the way, to my super chat, one of the most generous people I've ever met. I haven't met him yet, but you know what? He's in Australia. God bless you, Paul Bartlett. Thank you so very much. I will thank you if you go ahead and give a super chat. You don't have to if you're watching, but if you do, thank you so much. And if you're generous, like Paul is, at basically every live stream, he gives a super chat. It's so I'm so appreciative. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is that I will, thank you. But a couple of viewers made a very amusing comment. What's your deal with certain people? You're bringing up their names when they get what kind of racket is going on? What kind of scheme is going on? It's like, it's a super chat. Not many people give, which is totally fine. I'm not trying to, it's okay. I have amazing viewers. I have members on the channel. I have had the channel for a while. A whole bunch of people give super chats. Very, very thankful. But Paul has been very, very generous. Nicholas, there's been a lot of people that I, routinely thank because they routinely support the channel. That's why. It's not some kind of nefarious scheme. Anyway, it's just like one or two comments, but I had to address them. Anyway, this is a former FEC chairman stating there was literally no federal crime, which is exactly why it'll be overturned in addition to the immunity ruling.
Well, a former member of the Federal Election Commission, Hans von Spakovsky, agrees with the president, and he joins us now. Hans, thanks so much for being here.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Set this up for our viewers. What is this campaign finance law, and why do you say Donald Trump did not violate it?
It's called the Federal Election Campaign Act, and it governs the raising of money and the spending of money for all federal campaigns. That's anyone running for Congress or the presidency. Mr. Cohen pleaded guilty to a supposed violation of that law because of payments that were made, I guess you could call them hush money payments, to two women who were claiming that they had had affairs with the president. The problem with his guilty plea is that those payments aren't covered by the law. The only way these kind of expenses are covered under the law is if they are campaign-related expenses. And these are not campaign-related expenses. This is a potential personal liability of the president, and you actually can't use campaign funds, money that you've raised, because money
mentioned and quoted federal
pay for something like that.
Well, you had mentioned and quoted Federal Election Commission Chairman Brad Smith, who said that these payments to women were unseemly, but they're not necessarily illegal.
Yeah, and that's the key thing for people to keep in mind here. We're talking about what is an actual violation of federal law. And this is not something that the Federal Election Commission, and that's the independent agency that is supposed to enforce this law on a civil basis, and that's where I used to serve as a commissioner, it does not consider that these kind of payments are related to a campaign. Therefore, the rules and regulations don't apply to how that kind of a payment is made.
Do any of Michael Cohen's or the president's actions, Hans, constitute a civil offense?
No, I don't think they do, and they certainly don't constitute a criminal offense. Why? Well, because under the law, to prove a criminal violation of the campaign finance law, you have to prove that it was a knowing and willful violation. You can't prove that when you have former FEC commissioners saying it's not a violation of the law. You have the FEC saying it's not a violation of the law. That raises great doubts about it, and so how can anyone be found who have willfully and knowingly violated the law?
Michael Cohen, he says that this was done to sway the election, so doesn't that make it campaign related, Hans?
No, it doesn't, and here's why. There's another provision of the law, and this is something that the U.S. Attorney in New York is essentially ignoring. There's another provision of the law that says that an expenditure or an expense is not campaign related if it's an expense that would exist whether or not you're running for office. And that's why this is not a campaign expense. This is the kind of claim that celebrities of all kinds get fairly often, and it was not dependent on the president running for office. Yeah, it might affect his reputation, and it might running for Congress, and it get the election, but that does not necessarily make it a campaign-related expense under the applicable statute.
Hans, one last question for you. If this case, and I hope I'm not getting you to step outside of your lane too much, but if this case isn't based on campaign finance violations, what's the case that prosecutors, you believe, have here?
Well, remember, this was only one of 4 offenses that Cohen pleaded guilty to. The more serious charges were tax evasion, and financial fraud in applications that he submitted to a bank. He also pleaded guilty to lying to Congress. But the real offense here, the one that was most serious, was tax evasion. And that's why he was facing potentially a lot of time in jail because of that.
All right, Hans von Spakovsky.
So, tax evasion and a failed taxi medallion business. So, I mean, you can look back and it's like every single thing Democrats tried to do against Trump didn't work. The opposite took place. The Supreme Court has essentially already overturned the guilty conviction. Once it gets to them after the appeal process, which will be expedited because he's been sentenced, so it's kind of in a roundabout way, quote unquote, good for Trump that he's sentenced because it gets to the Supreme Court sooner rather than later. Democrats lost with immunity. They lost with the Colorado ballot. They lost the popular vote. They lost every battleground state. They lost the Senate, the House. They don't have the Supreme Court. They lost the Supreme Court. And they're losing really the future of modern American politics. More and more people, I'm not going to get into, I'm not going to get into regional politics or all I can say is, God bless you if you're affected by, terrible, terrible tragedies in the West Coast, East Coast, throughout the country. God bless you. People are looking and they're asking, hey, wait a second, all of media, all of Hollywood, all of the, every single publication out there, all you've heard was that Trump is terrible, Trump is horrible, but yet he won the popular vote. And people are asking questions like, well, wait, why is the Democratic Party spending so much time focusing on Trump when they're not focusing on, pressing issues? We'll just leave it at that. Okay, why aren't Democrats focused on pressing issues? Why are they focused on these bizarre fringe ideologies that they've infused within local, state, and federal politics, which don't really have any positive impact other than appeasing some kind of fringe ideological base? I'm speaking in algorithmically friendly roundabout terms, but why don't Democrats focus on major issues important to the country? Why are they focused on calling Trump a convicted felon when it only led to him winning the popular vote? That's all it did, is led to him winning the popular vote. Let's listen to Jonathan Turley.
The court denied Trump's application to halt a sentencing in that New York hush money case, which now will happen. The sentencing
that happened today only expedites the Supreme Court looking at the case, which is what you heard from John Yoo. They will.
Here's my question. So should we sit on our hands?
They will, when they hear the case, it's already overturned when it gets to them, meaning when the case gets to them and they have to review whether it's constitutional or not, it will be very likely a unanimous decision overturning the New York case, because the liberal justices know that a precedent against Trump means that state prosecutors can go after Democratic politicians under fictitious federal statutes.
Say there's nothing we can do. Let it all work its way through the courts in New York, despite all the.
Tough it out. Thank you so much, Paul, and tough it out. My super chat. Thank you.
Impacts, we said, despite the fact that those courts can't even catch up with the electoral process, and that decision for you, New York. So if I'm in California and I see that it worked in New York, because we have this lumbering appellate process, but I can interfere with an election. By the time the appellate process catches up with me, so be it. They're going to time it the same way. So this can really become a cancer on the political campaign system of the highest federal official in the United States, and the election there too. No,
Mark, I appreciate what you said in your opening statement, because the Supreme Court has made clear, not just in one offside comment, in 3 very clear decisions, that only the federal government can enforce federal law. Only the Justice Department and the Federal Election Commission can prosecute and bring suit for violations of federal election law. They're the guardians of how federal election should run. And so what happened here is that the DA, authority away, and basically decided to prosecute his own interpretation of federal law. That's not permissible under our separation of powers and federalism, and the Supreme Court will reverse if, as you say, Mark, they get a chance to hear this case.
So let's continue with Jonathan Turley after the sentencing. They will get a chance to look at the case and to decide whether it's constitutional or not. It's a slam dunk, 100% certainty. It could be very well unanimous. I think it will be unanimous because the liberal justices will look at this and say, wow, if New York can go after Trump without the Department of Justice involved, then Florida could go after Biden. then any state could go, any red state, Texas can go after a whole bunch of Democrats. Arkansas could go after Democrats.
Tomorrow, for reaction to this, Jonathan Turley, George Washington University law prof, and Charlie Hurt, Washington Times opinion editor, both Fox News contributors. Professor Turley, let's start with you. Look, the court doesn't like to intervene in what may be considered political matters. Your take on this, then I'll tell you what I think the court should have done.
Well, this is what some of us predicted when the appeals were just began. Merchan really played this perfectly, and I say that not as a compliment. That he knew that he was giving President-elect Trump very little runway by which to take an appeal off. He also knew that appellate courts generally prefer for sentences to be finalized, to review the case as a whole. And he played those two cards to guarantee that he'll be able to sentence President Trump tomorrow. And when that occurs, in many ways, he's going to create the ultimate mandate for President Trump. He will have established with finality the effect of lawfare on our political system. So President Trump will go in, as many on the left want him to go in, as a convicted felon. But for many people in this country, he will also go in as someone who was the victim of lawfare. This was the most outrageous of the cases. It was built on not a novel, but an unprecedented theory, one that even the Democratic senator from New Jersey recently called BS. I mean, said that it was completely invalid. And that's the mandate that he will give this president going into office.
Professor, we'll get to Charlie in just a second. When you look at this, though, one of the justifications for not granting the application for this stay was that it wasn't a real inconvenience to the presidency, because the judge had indicated there's not going to be.
But it is an inconvenience. The reason that the Supreme Court didn't block or prevent the sentencing was, like I said this week, they're assuming that the New York State Court didn't engage in political, warfare against Trump. They have to outwardly show that, well, it's a state decision, it's a conviction. We're the Supreme Court. We're not going to look at whether it's constitutional or not. We're just going to simply allow a state conviction to take place. Okay, but once it gets to them, for them to look at the constitutionality of the guilty verdict, it's a done deal. And anyway, this expedites it getting to the Supreme Court. So in a roundabout way, it's a good thing.
Be a jail time. It'll be there, but it won't be really inhibiting his work as president. But 4 justices said it disagreed with that. And the only one who didn't, who was one of the Republican nominees, is Amy Coney Barrett. Of course, John Roberts, the other one. But Amy Coney Barrett voted with the majority. So there were a core 4 who believed that this was significant enough to say, not pulling this nonsense.
That's right. And the division on that court really does reflect how troubling the case is overall.
So actually, that's not really that bad. You had Alito, from what I understand, you had Alito and Gorsuch and Thomas and Kavanaugh, who wanted to prevent the sentencing. And then you had Roberts and Barrett siding with the liberal justices. That's actually not that bad when you think about it, because you could easily get a 5-4 decision overturning the guilty verdict. Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Thomas, and Alito, will 100% certainty overturn the guilty verdict. You just need Roberts And Barrett, which you'll get one of the two, you'll probably get both, and you might even get also the liberal justices. Okay? It's a done deal, ladies and gentlemen. It's just a matter of when it gets to the Supreme Court. And yes, it is a cloud over the presidency. Maybe not initially, but for example, there might still be a gag order. Okay, you can't run your presidency risking a state court retribution for not abiding by, a never-ending gag order. That's one example.
What this trial level judge has done in Manhattan is to hold a presidential candidate first, now a president-elect, to his courtroom on a short leash. This is the same judge that gagged the leading candidate for president in a campaign where his case was one of the issues of most concern with voters. And it obviously is an equal concern among at least 4 justices.
Yeah, Charlie, look, on this case, I think it's such a travesty. It's one of those extraordinary cases where, allowing the process to go forward in normal course to the appellate. We have serious problems facing this country. President Trump doesn't need one more thing to deal with. That's my view. And I think those justices saw this for what it was in the dissent. And unfortunately, there are 5 who, disagreed. But
like Turley says, and we could just go back to this again, right here. Right here. It's going to get to the Supreme Court eventually, especially because of the sentencing. And when it does, it'll be overturned. Listen to this again.
I appreciate what you said in your opening statement, because the Supreme Court has made clear, not just in one offside comment, in 3 very clear decisions, that only the federal government can enforce federal law. Only the Justice Department and the Federal Election Commission can prosecute and bring suit for violations of federal election law. They're the guardians of how federal election should run. And so what happened here is that the DA, approved by this judge, Judge Merchan, grabbed the authority away and basically decided to prosecute his own interpretation of federal law. That's not permissible under our separation of powers and federalism, and the Supreme Court will reverse if, as you say, Mark, they get a chance to hear this case.
They will get a chance to hear the case eventually. And Jonathan Turley, in a second, says that.
Look, I guess it was a close call, according to Professor Turley.
It's an important point, and certainly the point that I think every American, whether you voted for Donald Trump or not, if you're part of that 59-60% of Americans who are express to pollsters that they're hopeful that we can sort of move in a positive direction, they're like, wait a minute, we got all these problems. This is not anywhere in the list of problems that I have. And then, of course, in this particular case, as Professor Turley just pointed out, the real damage here was letting the case go forward in the first place. That's when the real damage occurred here. And the gagging of somebody who's actually running for president, it runs counter to everything that we believe in terms of free speech and running robust campaigns in this country. And of course, Donald Trump won, and he beat all of it. And this is just a reminder, I think, for a lot of people of what the left and what these crazy prosecutors did and tried to do to try to thwart the will of the American people. And the American people looked at it and said, yeah, we don't care. We're not going to be confused about this. We're going to stick with the issues that we care about. And the issues in this case are not one of them.
Oh, yeah.
So Charlie Hurt is 100% right. Because, if anything, the New York prosecutors helped Trump win the popular vote. People were tired. They were tired of absurd leaps of logic, legal theories contorted into some nonsensical prosecution simply to just call Trump. It's not a political victory. It's not a moral or legal victory to call Trump a convicted felon. Those words have a semantic meaning that doesn't correlate to the reality of what Trump was accused of. He was accused of a record-keeping violation. Not breaking into a bank, not ending someone's life. A record keep. That was a misdemeanor. Then they elevated it to a felony. Unilaterally, the federal government wasn't involved. The Department of Justice looked at the hush money case. The Federal Election Commission looked at the hush money case. Rob, thank you. And dropped the case. Then the New York court said, oh, well, actually, he committed some kind of federal crime, and you know what? That elevates the misdemeanors into felonies, and so therefore he committed 34 different acts, felonious acts, which, of course, nobody even understands or believes. And so he's not a convicted felon in the traditional sense, or even in... There's no rational way to truly state that Trump is a convicted felon, knowing very well it'll be 100% overturned when the Supreme Court looks at the constitutionality of a state unilaterally deciding Trump committed a federal crime without the federal government, DOJ, or FEC involved, since all three dropped the case. Under our system of federalism, like John Yoo was saying, we can't have that.
Alvin Bragg was out today crowing about the case, saying how important it is for the country, Professor Turley. And I would also argue that Judge Merchan, by issuing this, quote, unconditional discharge in this case, also kind of implicitly, in my view, admits this is ridiculous. I mean, I'm sorry, but unconditional discharge, but he's a felon. To me, again, this is preposterous. And I think the court should have done away with this.
So, in the typical Democratic Party absurdity, Trump is a convicted felon, but no jail time. So they live and breathe public relations. That's why they spent $2.5 billion in the Harris campaign, which I think the entire $2.5 billion is lost now. Okay, they went from Biden is the most popular candidate of all time to we must remove Biden. Of course, Hollywood and Clooney and all these big celebrities said, oh, for the good of the country. Well, what do you mean? I thought he was the most popular candidate of all time. Surely he won fair and square, right? You're not alluding to some shenanigans, are you? Oh, no, he's the most popular candidate of all time. And then less than 4 years later, we remove him. We did him dirtier than they did. They did Biden in a far worse manner than anything they did to Bernie Sanders, which was already despicable and atrocious what they did to Bernie Sanders. But don't think that Bernard Sanders is going to say anything, because it's all about the Democratic Party. And so they cheated Bernie Sanders. They did far worse to Biden. Biden won his primary. I support Trump, and I'm like the only person defending Biden. On YouTube, I'm the only person on the planet defending Biden. He should have been the nominee, but the wonderful, morally superior, highly educated liberal Democrats, for some reason, decided to replace Biden. I don't know why. It makes no sense. Especially since one debate. You mean to say that you saw him, like the Democrats saw Biden perform on a national stage one time, and they didn't think that he was up for the task of going after Trump, but going against Trump, but he defeated Trump. So why wouldn't he be up to the task? Oh, maybe there's some merit to all the things Trump was saying.
I think the court got this one wrong, and I don't say it just because I support President Trump. I do support the presidency, though.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by Chief Justice Roberts. He often experiences a bit of sticker shock when it comes to institutional issues. He doesn't want to get the court ahead of the politics of the moment. This is fairly consistent, I would say, with his past rulings. And I say that, because I truly believe that what motivates him is the court as an institution. And he doesn't want to see the court at these critical moments making this decision. But the problem with what's happening in Manhattan is that this is the rawest form of lawfare. And of course, Bragg is its happiest warrior. But at the end of the day, you have a case that was a dead misdemeanor that was zapped back into life with this novel theory, then turned into this mountain of felonies. And then went before a judge that, in my view, discarded any sense of due process. We still do not know what the jury decided as to the underlying conduct in the case. I mean, I was in that courtroom.
So was I.
I was in disbelief as to how the court was ruling.
This was a raw abuse of judicial and prosecutorial power in the United States. That's what it was.
By the authoritarians and despots and totalitarians who oftentimes claim to be morally superior and highly educated.
But apparently we have 5 justices on the Supreme Court who think this just has to go through its normal course. Are we surprised, Jonathan, by Amy Coney Barrett in this or not?
No, Justice Barrett has been playing more and more of a central role or centrist role on the court. She's often voting with the left of the court. She's sort of carving out her own voice, her own place. And I don't want to condemn her for it. I can disagree with her decisions. She's a very thoughtful jurist. And what she did here is consistent with what a lot of appellate judges do. They really prefer overwhelmingly to have these key cases completed, to have the sentence in so they can review the whole case. They hate interlocutory appeals. They hate these things coming up in partial form. And so she's consistent in that regard.
Yeah, well, anytime you say interlocutory appeal on the Ingram angle, it's time to take a pause. Panel, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan.
So now we'll get to the immunity victory. So he has 2 avenues, actually numerous avenues, but he has 2 avenues. And David, thank you for being a member. Everyone here, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being a member. If you're a member of the channel, thank you for your super chat. And just hit subscribe. We're almost at 272,000 subscribers because of you. We're on our way to 300,000 subscribers, people. And I just can't thank you enough. I cannot thank each and every one of you enough for watching. But it'll get to the Supreme Court when they overturn the case completely. 100% certainty, like I told you, with the immunity and the Colorado ban, they will overturn this overtly, obscenely political effort to just call Trump a convicted felon with no jail time. Oh, what a felon. Not many convicted felons get 0 jail or prison time, okay? They've essentially, like Laura Ingraham said, admitted it was complete nonsense to begin with. But not only can a state not level a federal statute at somebody without the DOJ involved, and the DOJ dropped the hush money case, so it's purely unconstitutional, he is protected under presidential immunity, which means the Hope Hicks testimony, and also potentially the number of times that Michael Cohen perjured himself, almost certainly, can't be utilized as evidence. Okay, but let's continue.
President-elect Trump. Alina Habba. Alina, we love talking to you. It's wonderful to see you again. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. First, do you have any more details on the alleged misconduct by the juror in this case?
I do, as part of, obviously I'm part of the team, but those are not ones that I am willing to share at this point. What I can tell you is it's definitely egregious, despite the redactions and without getting into detail. It is not a questionable thing. There was misconduct by the jurors, and it would have anything thrown out. Now, one thing we are learning, as you've delicately said, but I will say more directly, Judge Merchan's description of what happened and what falls under the Supreme Court's decision is so flawed and egregious and so ridiculous. He is completely disregarding the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court that said that there is presidential immunity for official acts. And now he is trying to carve out in any way he can to preserve face and say that this trial was not a complete hoax, was not a complete disaster, an evidentiary disaster. And now we know there were issues with the jury being tainted. So, this is where we are. And this is where we've been for 3.5 years. And frankly, why I think we won.
Alina, so we've got allegations of a juror's misconduct in the case. Can you please tell us how this case is ripe for appeal? Legal experts have told us there are a lot of constitutional violations. The jury wrongly heard evidence that was protected by presidential immunity, the Supreme Court upheld, like President Trump's conversations with Hope Hicks. The judge delayed sentencing indefinitely. That's clearly a due process right to a speedy trial violation. And now juror misconduct, it sounds like that juror was tainted. There could have been bias here.
Yeah, let's add some to that. Statute of limitations, which before they brought this, we knew was passed. This case was passed up by Cy Vance. It was passed up prior by Bragg, and then it was brought again. How about we also discuss that the White House was coordinating and sent their own guy into work for the New York DA from the DOJ? How about that? How about selective prosecution, election interference, tying this man up in a hoax case during an election cycle when he should have been campaigning? How about all of the things you said? But this is where we have problems. The judge should have recused. We've said it time and time again. We have one thing standing right now before all the appeals we will take on this ridiculous decision today, and that is the motion to dismiss that this judge gave us leave to file. I don't have much hope in Judge Merchan. But we do have pending motions. Go ahead.
Sorry, Alina. So, Senator Chuck Grassley, has said this is really scary that all Americans, right or left, he's saying take the politics out of it. When you see the lawfare abuses, it could happen to you. It could happen to viewers. That's why millennial voters, we heard, were so scared about what the Justice Department and what cases like DA Bragg brought. They feel it could happen to them personally. This was a books and records misdemeanor, like a parking ticket, but it got ramped up into 34 felonies. That's terrifying for the American judicial system. Final word.
Yes, and he was not there. He was in the White House as president. These are acts that were done by an accounting team at the Trump organization. And there is so many uncanny things happening here. And the American people are afraid, and they should be afraid, but not anymore. Because I can assure you that when we go in and when this administration gets to work, it will be top of mind to fix this lawfare and prosecution against a political opponent or any American. It should not happen.
So, ladies and gentlemen, just like the unanimous Supreme Court ruling that overturned a state Supreme Court's decision, the Supreme Court, when it looks at, and hopefully very soon, it's a done deal. They've already, from the precedent with the Colorado decision overturning the Colorado ban unanimously, and with the immunity victory, and the fact that he didn't commit an FEC crime, according to 3 FEC chairmen, and the FEC itself and the DOJ itself, highly unconstitutional everything. It'll be overturned 100%. Hit subscribe to this channel right now. I'll see you tomorrow, everybody. God bless you all. Stay safe. Stay safe out there. God